Today on the Michael Eric Dyson Show, do you feel it's a public right to know what your government is doing and why?
That's where freedom of information laws, or access to government information, can be very important for citizens to evaluate. I mean, there are so many important inspection reports that the government conducts or should be conducting that the public should have access to.
This week in March marks Sunshine Week, an initiative that emphasizes the need for government openness and transparency. Here to talk about Sunshine Week is Andy Alexander, spokesman for the American Society of News Editors, which sponsors Sunshine Week. He's also a former ombudsman for the Washington Post. Andy, welcome to the Michael Eric Dyson Show.
Thanks very much for having me on.
Now, before we get into examples of the need for open government and freedom of information, tell us the history of Sunshine Week. It sounds like fun.
It actually has been fun. Sunshine Week is really an outgrowth of something that started in 2002 by the Florida Society of Newspaper Editors, and they became concerned that there were efforts in their legislature to restrict the flow of public information. And so on a Sunday in March of 2002, they launched what they called Sunshine Sunday, and they called on newspapers throughout the state to write about the importance of open government. They could either do stories or cartoons or editorials or columns. And it had a great success, and Florida has a really an admirable record of being an open record state. Mm-hmm. Well, as we in the American Society of News Editors looked across the country and saw that there were increasing assaults on freedom of information, we thought maybe we ought to try this nationally. So we did, and in 2005, with a grant from the Knight Foundation, we launched Sunshine Week. And it was the same principle of asking news organizations to just simply highlight the importance of this and maybe do some stories on local compliance with freedom of information laws. And when we did it, we thought, gosh, we'd be lucky if we got maybe, 50 or 70 newspapers to participate. We were stunned when hundreds of them participated in this first year, and every year since then, it's grown. It now includes broadcast outlets, a lot of digital outlets. There are civic groups, public libraries, universities, secondary schools, all sorts of essay contests. So it's really grown into quite a big thing, and there are even some foreign countries that have started to get involved in it.
Excellent. Now, can you give us a little bit more background? Let's go back a little further in the 70s with the original Sunshine Law. Can you give us some insight on that?
Yeah, the Federal Freedom of Information Act was actually signed into law in 1966 by Lyndon Johnson, and it took effect, I think, the middle of 1967. That law, for the first time, sort of codified the public's right to certain public information at the federal level that is not restricted by statute. Now, the interesting history of this is that if you go back and read Lyndon Johnson's proclamation and signing the law, it's full of all sorts of platitudes and rhetoric about the importance of public information. Mm-hmm. But we know through the archives that actually he was very reluctant to support this law, and it was sort of rammed through the Congress by several members who felt passionately about it. But since that time, it has basically it provides the right of citizens to request public information from their government, and each agency has public information officers that process this information. Mm-hmm. Now, this is separate, of course, from what goes on at the state and local levels. They have their own laws.
Gotcha. How much different is this from the actual Freedom of Information Act?
Well, it is the same.
It's the same.
The Freedom of Information Act is, as I mentioned, the federal law that took effect in the mid-1960s. So it's essentially the same thing.
Essentially the same thing. Now, Andy, once the laws start to change, how does the public start to further hold their elected officials accountable? And this is interesting because I know that there are people who take on the watchdog mentality, but the average citizen is really the watchdog.
You're absolutely right, and in fact, you've raised an important point here. When we created Sunshine Week, we were very careful to say that we were the instigators of this, but this is not a press issue, although the press obviously uses freedom of information laws to get access to government information. But this is really a citizens issue, and it really speaks to the importance of how we govern ourselves and hold our government officials to account. And it's interesting. There's a reason that we do this in March, and that is that it coincides with the birthday of James Madison. And of course, Madison, who is our third president, is widely seen as the father of the Constitution. But he was also seen as an early defender of open government. And there's a very famous quote from him, if I can recall it from memory, where he said, "Knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives." So it all really flows from Madison, and it was a marvelous concept hundreds of years ago, and more important than ever today.
Andy, let's put a hypothetical out there, taking a look at Japan and obviously the crisis going on there. The Sunshine Law and Freedom of Information, this is all obviously referring to the United States and United States law. But is Japan a case where residents would be better served if the government was more open, forthright about the dangers or risks in the wake of this earthquake, tsunami, and now these nuclear reactors breaking down?
Yeah, I'm afraid I can't answer that because I'm not familiar with Japanese law. But let's turn it back on the United States. I mean, instantly when you have a situation as the tragic disaster in Japan, our interest obviously turns to our own country,
right? And
that's where freedom of information laws or access to government information can be very important for citizens to evaluate safety regulations for nuclear facilities. I mean, this goes on across government. I mean, there are so many important inspection reports that the government conducts or should be conducting that the public should have access to. I mean, take it down to a very simple thing, restaurant health inspection reports. Those should always be public. I mean, there's nothing more important that you want to know before going to a new restaurant of whether or not it has health code violations.
Right.
Similarly, bridges. I can remember a couple years ago that MSNBC used the Freedom of Information Act to unearth the fact that more than 17,000 bridges in America hadn't received their required federal inspection in the last 2 years. Those are disasters waiting to happen, and as it applies to nuclear facilities in the United States, I think that's information that the public would want to know.
Exactly.